when you started coming out publicly with your position with respect to the war, how did the community respond? How did your family respond?
When I turned my draft card in, there were about 8 people in the city of Buffalo who had done the similar things. And I'm happy to say that 10 years later, there were over 1,000 in Buffalo. 650 indictments were dropped against people who'd refused. So I think that, so early on, there wasn't a lot of support.
We're talking what, like the late '60s?
Yeah, 68. And again, in the city of Buffalo, there were what was going on at the university, and then there was the city itself. They were definitely distinct entities. And the city of Buffalo Common Council, for example, passed numerous resolutions regarding student strikes at the university. And Buffalo police, of course, were involved in suppressing student activity.
We had the TPU.
The Tactical Patrol Unit, yeah.
Yeah, they were pretty awful.
Yeah, and then we had a Red Squad in Buffalo.
Yes,
too.
and then what later
And then,
became
of course,
the anti.
we had Sheriff Mike Amico. And,
Yes, he was just marvelous.
But these people were part of the power structure that existed in the city of Buffalo, and were responsible for attempts to frame people for drugs. I mean, one of the easiest ways to discredit a political activist is to charge them with some crime that's totally unrelated to whatever activity they're involved in, and hope to move forward and convict them and sentence them to jail, because then people get into a discussion about, well, he's just a drug taker, he was just a, whatever, a robber or whatever. And there was a lot of that going on in those days, particularly from the sheriff's department. And our own esteemed man in the sky, Kevin Cafferty, was an undercover agent in those days. He was a young man like I was.
Oh, I know he testified before a U.S. Senate subcommittee.
Yes.
Yeah, it was actually publicized, I think, in the Washington Post. But with respect to these Buffalo Common Council resolutions, what did they say? Do you have any recollection?
Primarily, they were focused on getting the Buffalo police involved in handling student strikes at the university.
You mean quashing?
Quashing,
No.
yeah.
But who was on the council at the time? Wasn't it Elfrida
Elfrida
Slomensky?
Slomensky, Lewandowski.
And they were reactionaries on the right.
Yes.
Yes. How did the media treat what you did? Was there any media coverage?
In those days, Buffalo had really, I mean, in hindsight, an incredibly active media, there were 2 newspapers.
Yes.
The Courier Express and the Buffalo News, a number of alternative press, three television stations, but a plethora of radio stations, and particularly WKBW radio was involved in the coverage of anti-war activities. It was always amazing. In those days, you could actually call a press conference, and the press would actually show up and would actually cover the story. Whether they agreed with us or not was irrelevant, but they were there to cover the news, and we were news, and the press covered us extremely well. I mean, both the Courier and the News had photographers and reporters at press conferences. Today you try and call an anti-war group, nobody shows up. I mean,
yes.
It's partly because they have no budget to show up, and
No.
partly because they are actively involved in not covering that stuff.
Now, was the press sympathetic?
Well, like today, reporters are there with so-called journalistic integrity, and so they won't divulge to you their feelings. But of course, you meet these guys enough, you start to get some kind of, hey, how you doing? And you realize that there wasn't a lot of sympathy from the press, in the sense that they at least, because they were covering the story, they at least understood what you were trying to say or get at. So were they sympathetic? I wouldn't describe them as sympathetic, but I would just say that they were attempting to cover the issue.
Great. Now, you decided not to go to Vietnam, and you mentioned earlier the Unitarian Church, and that's the one on Elmwood and Ferry, is
Correct.
that correct?
Yeah.
Oh, so what happened? You refused to report, or declined to report. So what happened?
Well, after four orders to report for induction, there's a psychological wearing down that occurs in that you can't get on with your life. You're sitting there waiting. Well, am I going to get arrested? What's going to happen? So, my friend Bruce Klein and I decided that we would bring that situation to a head by forcing the government's hand by taking what we knew to be a symbolic sanctuary in the church, and it was our intention, it was our hope that we would highlight our opposition to the war, that we would use the symbolic sanctuary to speak to people. And so on the day, it just happened that we were both ordered to report for induction on the exact same day. So on August 7th, 1968, Bruce and I stood in front of the Unitarian Church where we've been granted symbolic sanctuary, and burned our orders to report for induction and said we weren't going. And there were a lot of press there. It was quite a bold statement.
When exactly did this happen?
August 7th, 1968.
Oh, hadn't the church opened their doors to draft resistors?
The National Unitarian Universalist Association had gone on record urging their member congregations to offer symbolic sanctuary to highlight their members' opposition to the Vietnam War. I had been raised in the Unitarian Church here in Buffalo by my folks. I was a member of the church, and I had approached the church board about permission. It wasn't easily granted. It was quite a controversial statement. The vote by the congregation was really close, but they voted in favor of extending symbolic sanctuary. Certain parameters were set up between the members of the church and ourselves. We weren't allowed to have people overnight. Bruce and I could stay in the church, obviously. Their insurance policies required that there not be large gatherings inside the church. But they were the church was very cooperative and very supportive initially.
Now, how long were you at the church?
We
with
were there
Bruce
11
Klein?
days.
11 days?
And in the process, we started out, we had this press conference, and then for that night, people started showing up at the church, young people primarily, and church member congregants. And so there was some speeches given on the front steps of the church. The following night, there were 150 people. The night after that, there were 200 people. It just started snowballing. And it certainly had an effect on youth at that time. We started having events. There were folk singers. There were speeches. And one of the things I left out, Michael, Bruce's brother David Klein was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, at the time. He had just returned from Vietnam and he'd been wounded. And in the photographs of the time in front of the church, David's standing there. He came to support his brother and I. In fact, he told his brother not to go. He said, if you can do anything, don't go. And it was those words that moved Bruce to the point, the other Bruce, to the point of refusing. So we attracted all kinds of people, and then, of course, we attracted the people that were opposed to us. But for the most part, the people that we attracted were obviously young people, and interestingly enough, veterans of Vietnam. There's this narrative that Vietnam veterans came home to be spit upon by the anti-war movement. And in fact, I find that to be a totally not true situation. I mean, I'm sure there were incidents where Vietnam veterans were better word. But for the most part, the anti-war movement was concerned in bringing those troops home. And Vietnam veterans, of course, were concerned about coming home too. So there was in Buffalo at least, and I'm sure it's probably true across the country, there were a lot of Vietnam veterans in the anti-war movement in those early days. And they were telling young people, telling us, that what we were doing was right.
Now, how did the government respond? You and Bruce Klein had taken sanctuary at the church. You had hundreds of supporters. What did the federal government do?
Well, at first I think they were going to ignore us, but it got to, I mean, we really got a lot of attention. It was front page story in the news and the Courier. It was on the evening news every night. The numbers of people that were showing up to church was growing. It was pretty clear that we were making a stand.
Yes.
And the government ordered us to surrender and to turn ourselves into the FBI offices.
Now, how did the government do that?
They, Judge Henderson, federal district court judge at the time, ordered or issued summonses ordering us to appear in court. Said he wasn't going to tolerate us hiding out in the church any longer. And we, of course, we said we weren't hiding. We were there. Come get us
Wasn't
anytime.
Judge Henderson somewhat of a reactionary?
He was a really conservative judge who had
That's
issues
my
with
understanding.
alcohol.
Yes. And he was the chief judge at the time?
He was, yes. he was the chief judge, and then there's the judges. I don't know, you don't call them
Yes.
under them, but there were other judges. Judge John Curtin was a recently appointed district court judge at the time, and strangely enough, he was appointed by the then United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark.
So what? So you get this order from Judge Henderson.
So we get a summons on a Friday afternoon. We immediately call another press conference, and we burn the summonses and say, no, we're not going to be there. So the weekend goes by, and there's all kinds of activity going on around the church, and we realize that we're under surveillance by somebody who's stationed themselves in the third floor of a house directly across the street from the Unitarian Church.
This would have been on West Ferry?
Yes, and that was on a Saturday. Oh no, that was Friday night that we noticed it. On Saturday, there was a party in that house across the street that Bruce and I snuck across the street to attend. And the people that were having the party were young people. Their parents were, I don't know. And we were told, hey, there's some guys up there. And it was pretty clear at that point that we were being watched very closely. On Monday morning, on August 19th, 1968, 32 FBI agents, federal marshals, and border police, backed up by 100 local Buffalo cops, showed up at the church and asked us to come outside, surrender. We refused. And our intention was, we're going to force the federal authorities to come into this church, come up to the pulpit area of the church to effect their arrest, because we were trying to highlight some kind of a moral argument for why we were refusing, that we were opposed to killing, and we weren't going to participate, but that there was an altercation at the front door of the church. There were a number of people that were standing at the church that decided that they were going to blockade the FBI's attempt to enter the church. And I was standing in the pulpit at the time giving a speech, and I could see what was going on. I couldn't hear the request to come out and surrender, but it was pretty clear what they were doing. And then I saw the billy clubs come out and people start getting whacked, and I was pretty angry by it. But Bruce and I had made this decision, so the cops clearly were arresting people in the doorway. There was commotion in the church itself. They come down the aisle of the church. The lead marshal in charge, a guy named Alvin Grossman, had a restraining chain in his hand that he was swinging as he came down. The restraining chain goes around your waist and your handcuffs are attached to it. And he came up behind me and whacked me over the back of the head. And at that point, I lost it and started fighting and struggling and throwing punches. And they had me on the ground. One of the federal marshals was whacking me with about a 6-inch long lead-filled little billy club, and he's trying to hold me down. He stuck his hand in my face, and I bit his thumb. It got pretty well for a few minutes there. Well, not even, probably 30 seconds. It was a little give and take. I was hauled out of the church and were taken down to the federal courthouse, thrown into a federal holding cell, and looked around and realized there were a bunch of us there. It wasn't just Bruce Klein. And the federal government ended up charging us with forcibly assaulting, impeding, opposing, resisting, or interfering with a federal marshal or a federal officer trying to carry out their official duties. And I was charged with 3 counts, 3 different officers I was charged with fighting or resisting with. And so were 8 others. And Bruce Klein was charged with refusing induction, so was I, of course. And when we took stock of ourselves, we realized that of the 9 people arrested, 5 were Vietnam vets. And of the 9 people arrested, each person represented a different faction within the anti-war movement. One person was Peace and Freedom. One person was, Bruce and I were Buffalo Draft Resistance. There were SDS members.
Now, what did you call yourself?
We became known as the Buffalo Nine. It seems in those days that there was the Chicago 8.
Yes.
But we made up a baseball team. We were the Buffalo Nine.
Stay tuned for part 3.